on the phone the senior education writer for Politico, Stephanie Simon, on her piece, Taxpayers Fund Creationism in the Classroom. Welcome to the program, Stephanie.
Thanks, Sam. Good to be here.
I think this is going to come to a bit of surprise for people. The Supreme Court has ruled over, I guess, really decades of findings that public schools cannot teach creationism or intelligent design because for those of us who subscribe to science, this is basically just tantamount to teaching religion. How much money are taxpayers spending right now to teach creationism?
Well, so as you said, public schools cannot teach creationism or intelligent design. There's still pop-up examples here and there in some states where teachers do slip it in or do downplay evolution, but that's the general rule, as you said. But at the same time, the Supreme Court has also ruled that voucher programs are illegal, and you can spend public money to subsidize religious schools by giving parents money to pay the tuition at the private schools, even if they are religious, even if they teach creationism. So overall, there's 14 states that have active voucher or similar programs, and all told, taxpayers in those states will be spending about $1 billion this year on tuition for private schools. Now, not all of them teach creationism, of course, but hundreds of them do, and we looked at schools in a whole across those 14 states and found hundreds that do teach creationism and that even go farther than just teaching the biblical view that Earth was created in 6 days, less than 10,000 years ago, and they go beyond that and really try to nurture a distrust of mainstream science and modern discoveries.
Stephanie, so when you say that, obviously there's an implicit attack on science when you teach creationism, but give me some examples of some of the explicit attacks on science that we find in these publicly funded private religious schools.
Right. Okay. Well, there's plenty of examples if you look through their curricula, if you look through their websites, and if you look through their textbooks, where they really in all subjects from math and science, the way that they teach literature and writing as well, they just nurture the view that the Bible is the single infallible word, and that anything that contradicts it that the students might encounter in a museum or in a secular textbook or in a newspaper must be wrong if it contradicts the Bible. So that's sort of the overall overarching theme. And some specific examples we found, for example, a school that receives public subsidies in Philadelphia talks about on its website how it understands that men and women of science and history have made different discoveries throughout the years, but it says we filter all, our understanding is not complete until we filter those through God's Word. And with the help of the Bible, they say our students will be trained to disprove the fake and vain philosophies of the world. So their whole prism is that a lot of what we understand as modern discoveries are untrue, and that students will be taught to discern that.
And there's you write that one set of books calls evolution a wicked and vain philosophy and derides modern math theorists.
Exactly right. They say even math. One set of textbooks that's very popular in these schools. They don't want any modern math theories like set theory, for example, which allows for seemingly contradictory things like opposing sets of numbers to be held in the same set, and to them that contradicts the view that God established mathematics as a perfect set of laws and it's very orderly, and that's how they want to teach it, just straight from Scripture.
And it's not just in the context of I guess they may refer to these as science classes, but they seem to sort of push this anti-science, pro-creationism view throughout the curricula.
Right, exactly. So the kids in the younger grades are learning vocabulary with sentences like many scientists are creationists, or God has sole authority over the universe, things like that. So it threads through all their subjects. Even in high school algebra and geometry classes, we found indications on the curriculum that they spend part of the class time studying numbers in the Bible. So even when they're covering sort of wholly secular content, they find a way to integrate that into their curriculum.
Okay, so how is it that this federal, well, I don't know if it's federal money, it's primarily state money, but some of that comes, I guess, from the federal government. What is the apparatus by which this is happening, and who's pushing it?
Well, it's mostly state money, and there's two different types of programs. So one would be a straight voucher program where the state provides money that it would normally be paying to send the child to public school, basically cuts a check to the parent for the parent to transmit to the private school and pay tuition that way. And the other way that taxpayers bankroll these programs is through tax credit scholarships, in which states promise individuals or corporations huge tax breaks. Often it's one-to-one tax credit if they make donations to nonprofits that then provide the money to parents to send the kids to private schools. So, for example, if a corporation donates $1 million to one of these scholarship funds, they get $1 million off their tax bill. So that's sort of an indirect taxpayer subsidy. Obviously, that's $1 million that's not going into the state treasury. That's not being used for roads and schools and everything else that the government would normally be using public funds for. So those are the two main mechanisms.
And so we're talking about tax expenditures and direct subsidies. And now you say there's only 250,000 students who are recipients, essentially, of these either tax expenditures or these direct subsidies. But this is just a fraction, obviously, of the number of public school students in the country. But it seems like the trajectory is incredibly steep in terms of the growth of these programs.
Exactly. They've been growing by leaps and bounds over the past decade, really, and just in the past 3 years, the number of students attending private school on these tax-funded scholarships and vouchers is up 30%. And they're poised for much further growth. Our story looks at 24, 25 states are now considering either expanding existing programs or launching new ones. And you also have growth built into several states. So, for example, in Florida, they now spend about $285 million on tax credit scholarships for students, so subsidizing the private schools. And that's scheduled to more than triple over the next few years. Soon it'll be, by 2018, it'll be $700 million, up from $280 million. So that's a sizable increase just in that one state. And other states also have escalators in terms of the number of students that can be receiving these scholarships.
And so, just to be clear, these are already baked into the cake. I mean, there is no need for any further action when you're talking about a state like Florida. They have an automatic increase of like 25% each year. What drives that? In other words, do they just simply are they expanding the pool of recipients, or what's the mechanism in which that grows automatically?
Well, in Florida's case, they're raising the cap for tax credit availability. So right now they only allow a certain number of donations to get one-to-one tax credits, but that's what's going to escalate. So companies will be able to get more and more of their will be able to donate more and more to scholarship funds and get that amount erased from their taxes. Relations, enhancer to say that they've donated to help poor kids go to private schools, and at the same time their liability is erased on the other end from their state taxes. And in terms of growth, I mean, a lot of these programs have waiting lists. There's a lot of parents who want to get their kids into private schools with state help, so that's one source for expansion. Also, often lawmakers expand the pool of who's eligible, so they often start these programs aiming them at low-income children, but then steadily raise the cap so that middle-income and even in some cases what you might consider upper-income families are eligible for vouchers or partial vouchers. They expand the definition of special needs students, so it's not just students with severe special needs who are eligible for these programs, but kids with food allergies or other health issues that require sort of minor accommodations, but not major ones. They would be eligible. So there's all sorts of mechanisms for increasing who's eligible for these subsidies.
And when we talk about these type of programs increasing 30% over the past, 4 years, maybe. if that. What's the impetus behind this? I mean, when I see 2010, the first thing that occurs to me is that there was a big wave of Republican takeover of state houses. What else is driving this increase?
Right. Well, the supporters of vouchers have very skillfully laid the groundwork for these expansions and for new programs over the past decade. They've been supporting a lot of Republicans, but also a lot of Democrats in primaries and in state legislative races, putting a lot of money into independent expenditures in those legislative races to elect both Republicans and Democrats who support vouchers, and then they have a ready base for when they're ready to pitch a bill expanding those programs. The other thing that they've done very skillfully is to gather support from minority communities, and especially in Florida, for instance, they've been very successful at getting the support from African American ministers, and they pitch these programs as a way for low-income minority students to escape their public schools, which may not be doing well, and to go to private schools and religious schools. And once they get the ministers on board, they're able to build community pressure for lawmakers, even Democratic lawmakers from those areas, to consider these programs. And then you have lobbying advocacy groups like Americans for Prosperity, the Koch-funded group, funded by the Koch brothers, that's been extremely active in pushing for vouchers in a number of states in the past few years especially.
What can you tell us about the American Federation for Children? You mentioned them along with the Americans for Prosperity as big outside expenditure groups.
Sure, they're one of the groups that's been the most active on vouchers, and they've spent about $18 million since 2007 or 2008 on state legislative races. So that goes a long way in a lot of states. I mean, $18 million is a drop in the bucket when you're looking at federal races, but it's pretty substantial when you're looking at state legislative races. And they are a group that's heavily funded by the DeVos family in Michigan, Betsy DeVos in particular, who are big Republican donors and have long been supportive of school choice and vouchers in particular.
You know, I mean, and I want to talk about, give us a sense. I mean, ultimately, I want to talk about this sort of, there's almost like two agendas here built into one. But before we get there, let's talk about what we know in terms of the argument that these private schools, serve underserved communities better than public schools and provide better results. I mean, there's sort of two different arguments that are made. One is that this is giving choice to kids who don't have access to a good public school, and the other one is that outcomes are better at these private schools. Take both of those on for us.
Right. So as you said, one of the key arguments is parent choice, and the supporters of vouchers will say that it's really only fair for for low-income parents to have the same choice that upper-income parents have. Of course, no one is stopping an upper-income family from paying tuition at a private school on their own and teaching their kids creationism or anything else that they want taught at the private school, or from homeschooling their parents. So the idea is that these programs give the same options to lower income families. And the other argument that proponents always make is that the voucher programs let kids escape from failing public schools. But we looked very substantially or very carefully at the studies that voucher proponents cite, both in this story and in a previous story I did for Politico, and we found that there's very little evidence that vouchers actually help low-income students or really any students succeed more than they would have in their public schools. And there's evidence for certain groups. For example, you could say one particular voucher program helped African American students enroll in college at a higher rate, but it didn't help any of the other participants, the Hispanic or white participants in that program. So there's no evidence of across-the-board academic outcomes improving for these voucher students. And when you look at specific programs in specific cities, for instance, Milwaukee's had a long-standing voucher program. They're one of the few places that actually requires students to receive vouchers to take the same test as kids in public schools. And when you look at the most recent test scores, only 13% of the kids who took vouchers to go to private schools scored proficient in math, only 11% scored proficient in reading, and both of those are worse than the public school students in Milwaukee, many of whom are share the same demographics as being low income and heavily minority populations. So that's just one example where you're not seeing any substantial gain for those students from going to the private schools.
And this is not even taking into account the sort of the self-selecting nature, right? I mean, because if you come from a family that is seeking these vouchers, and you coming from a family that is seeking to that is that involved in your education, in the education outcomes. I mean, there's a certain social capital there, right? That is uncounted insofar as what we know in terms of what kids succeed in school is often a function of what their circumstances at home are.
Exactly. So you're not, just as with charter schools, that people who apply to voucher schools come from families that, are interested in helping their education, have the wherewithal to figure out how to apply for a state program and how to get their applications in. And in the case of voucher schools and charter schools, also, they don't necessarily have to offer transportation or subsidized lunches. Students might be required to buy their own uniforms. So even while the students might all fall into the low-income bucket in terms of being eligible for a subsidized lunch, they are often drawn from the upper end of that bucket. So, for instance, a family that can afford to pay $100 for a couple school uniforms, or to afford to send their child with lunch every day because the school doesn't provide it, afford to get them to school without a school bus providing that transportation. So, so that's another difference. And I'll also point out that with the voucher schools, they are allowed to, the religious schools are allowed to screen their applicants to make sure that they conform to the religious faith of the school in question. So private schools accepting public subsidies can turn away gay or lesbian students, or even students with gay or lesbian parents, or any student who refuses to sign a statement of faith. So they are selective in that way.
Do we have a sense of how much discrimination? I mean, they obviously have the ability to do so. Do we, despite the fact that they're receiving taxpayer money, do we have a sense of how much that's happening?
How much what's happening? I'm sorry.
The discrimination of kids who refuse to sign some statement of faith, or who are come from the LGBT community.
Well, it's pretty widespread. I mean, a lot of the schools that teach creationism, or even that don't, that are just religiously based schools, do require that statement of faith and do make clear in their handbook that they can reject or expel students who don't live up to their view of appropriate conduct, which would include, strictly heterosexual behavior. So they can certainly, they can and do certainly do that. I mean, I have no idea. There's no statistics on how many kids apply and turn away, but it's very explicitly stated when you apply what criteria you have to meet to get in. So I would bet a lot of those students don't even apply. The same thing with disabilities. The schools don't have to accommodate students with disabilities, so a lot of those students are left out from these programs.
You mentioned that in Milwaukee, when the students who are recipients of these vouchers at these private schools are tested in the same way that the public students are. Public school students, they don't do as well. Is there any? I mean, one of the issues here is that there seems to be zero accountability. I mean, once the taxpayer gives this money essentially for the kid to attend the school, there's no way for the public to measure or to hold account that these kids are getting any type of legitimate education.
Right. Well, that's a very tricky subject, and a subject of very heated debate even within the community of voucher supporters. There are some programs like Milwaukee, I mentioned, Cleveland, Louisiana, large established programs that do require the kids in voucher schools to take the same test as kids in public schools, and that at least makes comparisons easier. It's not perfect because schools that only have a few voucher students don't have to report their scores so as not to violate their privacy. And there's other things that make it a little hard to make the comparisons, but at least you have some basis there. But there are a huge number of other programs, including the ones in Florida, that do not require the kids to take the same tests as their public school peers. And the argument there is that the whole point of school choice is allowing parents to pick a curriculum and a program that matches their kids' needs. And if the private schools are forced to give the same test as public schools, they'll have to teach to the same curriculum, teach to the same standards, and therefore they won't be special anymore. That you'll lose the sense of uniqueness that is what drew parents there in the first place. So that's the subject of very heated debate in the pro school choice community.
And indeed, in many of the schools that you report on, they almost explicitly say that, what many of us would consider the sort of the bedrocks of education are sort of job number two. Just talk about that for a moment.
Right. That was an interesting thing that we found while looking at the schools that teach creationism. We found that some of them were very explicit in saying that their number one goal was not to provide a top quality education for their students in terms of academic education. Their goal was to teach their students to obey the Lord, to revere the Scriptures, and that was their number one priority. One of the schools we looked at, said on its website that our teachers are hired primarily for their faith in Jesus. And so then, secondarily it said, and we look for teachers who are certified and so on. But, that was clearly their first priority, was to have teachers that shared and could share that faith with the students. And we have some other examples of that in the story, too, of schools that stated that their primary purpose or what they would be the most proud of is if their students emerged attending religious services regularly, having faith in the Bible as an infallible guide to their life, and so on, rather than valuing academic performance.
And to what extent are these voucher programs building or picking up any momentum on a federal level? I mean, these vouchers. I mean, are we seeing the similar, at least attempts to build out this voucher program now on a federal level?
Yes, well, President Obama has been a big supporter of school choice in terms of charter schools, which are public schools that are privately managed, but he does not support the voucher programs, and every year he's tried to zero out funding for a voucher program in Washington, D.C., and the Congress has reinstated that funding. But but Republicans in Congress have made an effort to expand federal funding for voucher programs, and they're pushing a couple of different bills that would greatly expand voucher programs for using public money for federal money for voucher programs. Those are not really going to go anywhere unless the Senate changes hands, but we'll see what happens in November.
Now, I want to read this quote from your piece because this was just, this I think is there. I mean, aside from the notion of children receiving creationism in lieu of science, I think there are even sort of like broader issues here. One is other topics. I want to just quote you back to yourself because this is just stunning. Doug Tuthill, who runs one of the largest private school choice programs in the nation, says states have no right to determine what kids should learn beyond basic math, reading, and writing. Other topics, from the age of the earth to the reasons for the Civil War, are just too controversial for a government mandate, he said, even when taxpayer money is at stake. We're going, I understand what polls say about creationism in terms of how many people in this country believe it. But that's a pretty big leap to the reasons of the Civil War. What other topics are at play here for a guy like Doug Tuthill? And tell us exactly, what that private school choice program that he runs is, because this is pretty stunning stuff.
Right. Well, he runs Step Up for Students, which is the biggest group in Florida that that distributes those tax credit scholarships I mentioned. So corporations can donate money to his organization, and then they distribute the scholarships to the low-income students, and meanwhile the corporations get their tax credit for it. So so he and other school choice advocates argue that really the curriculum should be entirely, the state should be entirely hands-off. And his statement surprised me when I talked to him. I asked him, don't you think that students should have a basic grounding in civics, say, or understanding of American democracy and how it works, or the mechanisms for getting a bill passed, all those things we remember learning in social studies. And he just kept reiterating to me that he feels that the government doesn't have the right to mandate any of that, and that as long as a school teaches kids basic math and literacy, that should be that should be the floor for federal mandates. So his view is that we have to have a very hands-off approach to these private schools, even when they're receiving public money. And if you look at the textbooks that some of these faith-based schools use, they are very explicit, too, in their history textbooks about not presenting what they call a revisionist view of history. They want to focus on the Christian heritage of the United States, emphasizing things specifically from a evangelical Christian perspective, and so that flows through their teaching of U.S. history in every realm, and world history as well. I mean, for example, one of the textbooks I looked at talked about how Muslim groups have made some contributions to the world, but are also bent on conquest, and that students should be focused on trying to win Muslims over to Christianity and to an understanding of Jesus. So that's part of their history textbook right there.
Wow. And what of? I mean, are we seeing this in other religious? I mean, is it? I assume it's not just Christian schools that are on the receiving end of these vouchers. Are there Muslim schools? Are there?
Yeah, actually, that's been interesting because in some states there's been a controversy in Louisiana, for example, when lawmakers who were supporting a voucher program there realized that there could be some Islamic schools that also applied for this. They were not too happy about it, but the program ended up going through as well. And of course, they can't limit which type of religion the schools teach. So there are some Islamic schools that teach that teach their philosophy and their religion as well. I didn't look at the textbooks or curriculum for those, so I can't say what specifically they're teaching. But there absolutely are some schools that teach all sorts of different religious faiths.
I'd be really curious to see the reaction if there were textbooks in any of these Islamic schools that said that Islam is the one true religion and that Christians must be forcibly converted. And it would be interesting to see the reaction of some of the people who funded these programs. But getting back to Doug Tuthill, that organization that he runs, is that a for-profit organization?
No, that's a nonprofit organization, but it receives a cut of the funding from the tax credit scholarship. So, for example, as I said earlier, companies can donate $1 million and get $1 million off their tax liability, and that $1 million is supposed to go to fund scholarships, but they receive a percentage of that for their administration and for marketing. They do a lot of marketing to try to drum up demand for the private school scholarships.
Are there any, in the course of your reporting, did you find any sort of large profit centers in these schemes? I mean, obviously, the private schools do well because they're getting government subsidies. Are there any other sort of profit centers in this?
Well, in Florida, the fee for example, his nonprofit, their fee is very small. I think it's about 3%. I don't have that right in front of me, but some other states like Pennsylvania allow the sort of middleman organizations that distribute the scholarships and collect the donations from companies to take a much larger cut. So they're still not technically for-profit organizations, but they can spend a lot more on their salaries, administration, and so on, and marketing the program. But in terms of profit center, it's not necessarily that these schools are making a profit, but they certainly, in some cases, are keeping afloat because of these subsidies. So they're in Milwaukee, a huge number of the schools, don't have it right in front of me, but I believe it was 3/4 of the schools receiving public subsidies have 90% or more of their students on vouchers, so they basically wouldn't be surviving unless they had the public subsidies. And in New York, Cardinal Timothy Dolan has been lobbying for a tax credit program, basically a voucher program there in New York, in part because he wants to help some of these Catholic schools that have really struggled to attract students and tuition-paying families to survive. So it's clearly a way to help these faith-based and secular private schools stay afloat when they might not be able to make it in the free market.
You don't address this in the piece, but I mean, is there any one of these states that provide for these type of vouchers and tax expenditures which haven't cut their public school budgets?
Well, a number of states, I mean, almost every state cut their public school budget in the past during the recession. So Pennsylvania, for example, has a very large a voucher program, not voucher, tax credit subsidy program, and they made substantial cuts to their public school budget. I mean, it's hard to draw a one-to-one correlation. In some cases, advocates for these programs say that they're actually saving the state money because they might be spending $7,000 to educate a student in a public school, but only giving the private school $5,000 for that student to have a voucher to attend a private school. So in that case, they'd be saving, $2,000 on that particular student. The problem is that some of the way the eligibility is structured, these programs bring in kids who were never in the public schools to begin with. So in Wisconsin, 2/3 of the kids on the Wisconsin voucher program were already attending a private school before they started receiving vouchers. So somehow their family was affording the tuition on their own. Now they're able to receive public subsidies for it. So that's a net cost to the state. So it's very hard to parse out exactly whether these programs are costing taxpayers or costing public schools money or saving them money. And a lot of it depends on the specific mechanisms of who's eligible and how they're funded state by state.
What I found really striking about your piece, too, and sort of a light bulb went off in my head, was in the last couple of paragraphs, you talked to a Neil McCluskey, who's an education analyst at the Libertarian Cato Institute. It was in the context of your mentioning that there's been studies that I think I've certainly seen over the past couple of years, or back in 2007, that said that there were teachers who were beginning to sort of soft pedal evolution for fear of getting in trouble with their school boards in regards to creationism. And his response to this was that this is a good argument as to why we should have a voucher system, because you don't want to have a muddled education. And this way you can sort of, I guess, have more pure either science or creationism. But it occurs to me that this also dovetails with a larger ideological push to attack public schools and defund them. Is that your sense? I mean, in other words, are we looking at a movement that is driven by an agenda to teach sort of fundamentalist religious values, but sort of dovetails and runs in parallel with an ideological push to essentially undercut public education in this country?
Well, there's certainly people who would argue that. I mean, the education historian Diane Ravitch has written a book that basically makes that argument. But I think some of it is, I mean, there's just a lot of genuine passion and disagreement on this issue. One, as you said, the folks at the Cato Institute, which is a libertarian think tank, are just convinced that if everybody was able to go their own way and pick their own curriculum, then you'd get a lot stronger education, academic education for those who wanted, and those who wanted religious education could get that, and so on and so forth. The interesting thing to me is that in the country right now, we're having a big debate and a big, really bipartisan push for the Common Core. So those are academic standards that are supposed to guide the instruction of math and language arts for kindergarten through 12th grade. 45 states have adopted them, and they're rolling out in classrooms now. And the whole idea of the Common Core is, as the name implies, that there's a common core of knowledge that we should be imparting to our students. And the voucher programs really run contrary to and undercut that idea by saying that there isn't a common core of curriculum that everyone should be able to learn and understand, and that it should be up to parents to decide what's important for their kids to know, and the state should fund any one of those options, whatever parents choose. The thing that's interesting to me is that some of the same people who support vouchers also support the Common Core, and they don't see a contradiction in that. They feel like if you're in a public school, you should do the Common Core and be able to know these basic set of facts and skills, but you also should have the free right to go to a private school that disregards that entirely.
I mean, but how does someone like from the Cato Institute reconcile the notion that you've got so many of these private schools that are being kept afloat by a government subsidy? I mean, hasn't the free market spoken in terms of those schools? How do they reconcile that?
Yeah, that's a very good point. You'll have to ask them that. I mean, they're just passionately committed to the idea of school choice, but I do not know how they handle that apparent contradiction there, because there are plenty of schools that are afloat only because of these public subsidies.
And do we have a notion of it all, of how this implicates public schools? I mean, you mentioned that we're subsidizing the existence of a lot of these private schools, and that a lot of students, and I don't know if there is nationwide data on how many of those several 100,000 students, I guess it is, that are being subsidized to go to these private schools, how many of them were already going to private schools in the first place? In other words,
right. There's very little data on that. As I mentioned, Wisconsin's program, which is small, but there's a separate Wisconsin program, which is separate from its Milwaukee program, confusingly. But the statewide Wisconsin program, as I said, 2/3 of the kids were already in private schools, and another 5% were being homeschooled before they even got these vouchers. And a number of states are now allowing students who are entering kindergarten to get the vouchers. So they don't need to have ever tried a public school. So a lot of the rhetoric around vouchers is this is a way to help kids escape from failing public schools. But in many of these programs, you don't ever have to have tried the public school to assess for yourself whether it worked for your student. If you start young enough, you can get a voucher, when they're 5 and just going into kindergarten.
Yeah, and I mean, and just getting back to that point about the sort of the two separate agendas. I mean, I have no doubt that there are a significant number of parents who have a sincere belief that they don't want their kids tainted by secular teaching. But when I see that the Americans for Prosperity are lobbying heavily for this, I guess my question is, from a political standpoint, is there more of a convergence that we're seeing between the sort of libertarians who simply want this notion of a more privatized education system, merging with the desire of religious folk who don't want their kids to learn secular things, I guess?
Yeah, that could definitely be the case. I'm one of the things that I wrote a story a couple months ago about the Republican push to support school choice and including vouchers, and how they very explicitly saw this as a great winning political issue because it would help them reach out to low-income and minority families and tell them, look, we're on your side. We're going to help you attend a private school if you want to, pick your kid's own curriculum if you want to. And they saw this as a way to differentiate themselves from Democrats who generally, though not always, don't support the voucher programs. So it's a very explicit political strategy on the Republican side. It also, dovetails with their general philosophy of giving more freedom to the individual and to the state. So it's not a hypocritical stance, but it's their choice to emphasize it is definitely political, and they're hoping it will help them in the midterms and in 2016. I mean, you've seen Governor Bobby Jindal of Louisiana be very aggressive on this front. He's been fighting President Obama over federal attempts to monitor their voucher program in Louisiana, and at every turn he's been hammering at the president for denying low-income and minority students a chance to escape their public schools and go to private schools in Louisiana, and has made this a very strong focus of his potential presidential campaign.
Well, it's a fascinating report. It's also a little bit disturbing, frankly. But Stephanie Simon, great reporting on this, and thanks so much for taking the time today.